Alan Price waved politely to his neighbor every morning, watered his lawn with precision, and never once raised suspicion. Until the day Emily Sanderson vanished, and the town of Maplewood learned that the quiet man next door had been hiding a soundproof room beneath his home, Alan Price blended into the background of Maplewood like the old park benches and faded storefronts. He was the kind of man who never drew attention to himself, and in a small town like this, that was exactly the kind of person people felt comfortable around. In a neighborhood where everyone knew everyone, Alan was the neighbor who never made waves. He nodded politely to the mailman, picked up trash along the sidewalk, and brought in his neighbors' packages when they weren't home. He lived alone in a beige two-story house with trimmed hedges and wind chimes that jingled softly whenever a breeze passed through. It was the kind of house that looked as ordinary on the inside as it did on the outside, or so everyone assumed. He had worked at the same print shop since his 20s. Every morning, he arrived precisely at 7:55 a.m., wearing neatly pressed slacks and a plain button-down shirt, always long-sleeved regardless of the weather. He never took sick days. He never came in late. Customers who interacted with him described him as respectful, helpful, and always composed. He never raised his voice, never made anyone uncomfortable, and never stepped out of line. But there were small, quiet things about Alan that were off, things that, in hindsight, no one could quite explain. He always parked his car exactly 2 inches from the curb, never more, never less. He never had guests. There were no birthday balloons, no deliveries from florists, no signs of a social life. Kids in the neighborhood whispered that his lights never turned off. One boy claimed to have seen Alan standing in his window at 3 a.m., just staring at the street with a completely blank expression. But these details felt more like stories passed between kids to make the ordinary feel exciting. Adults laughed them off. Maplewood wasn't the kind of place where things like that happened. Until they did. The only person who seemed genuinely uneasy about Alan was his next-door neighbor, Mrs. Linda Crane. A retired school teacher with sharp eyes and a sharper instinct, she had a habit of noticing what others didn't. She once mentioned to a friend that Alan's garbage cans were unnaturally clean. Not just tidy, clean, as if they'd never been used. Another time, she said she saw Alan pulling into his driveway with what looked like large black garbage bags stuffed in the trunk of his car, but he unloaded them quickly, and when she glanced outside again, the trunk was closed, and Alan was mowing his lawn like nothing had happened. People dismissed her comments as paranoia, the harmless chatter of an elderly woman with too much time on her hands. Even she began to doubt herself. After all, Alan Price had lived there for over a decade and had never once given anyone a real reason to worry. That all began to change one Thursday evening in late October, when a loud knock echoed through the neighborhood. Police were going door to door, asking if anyone had seen a 17-year-old girl who never made it home. She had last been seen walking down Pine Street, the very street Alan lived on, just before sunset. Her name was Emily Sanderson, and within 24 hours her name was on every local newscast, every social media feed, every set of lips in town. Neighbors exchanged nervous glances. Some were quick to theorize. Maybe she ran away. Maybe she got into the wrong car. But a thin thread of tension had begun to weave itself through the community, wrapping tighter and tighter with each passing day. No one suspected Alan. Why would they? He even helped tape missing posters to lampposts and dropped off bottled water for the search teams. He told police they could search his yard if they wanted to. Nothing seemed out of place, nothing was ever out of place with Alan Price, and yet the sense that something was wrong didn't go away. It only grew. Emily Sanderson's disappearance sent a quiet shockwave through Maplewood, the kind that doesn't explode all at once but spreads slowly, steadily infecting every corner of the town. She wasn't the kind of teenager to vanish without a trace. Bright, responsible, and grounded, Emily had been walking home from the local library, a path she'd taken 100 times. That Thursday evening, she texted her mother at 6:12 p.m., letting her know she'd be home in 20 minutes. She never arrived. The next morning, her phone was found lying in the grass near a bus stop just 3 blocks from her house. Her backpack was discovered beside it, unzipped, its contents scattered. A notebook, a library book, a chapstick. There were no signs of a struggle, no blood, no screams reported. It was as if she'd simply evaporated into the air. Police mobilized quickly. Search parties formed within hours. Volunteers combed wooded areas, culverts, old sheds, and railroad tracks. Helicopters buzzed overhead. Emily's face appeared on every television screen and telephone pole. The community clung to hope, desperate to believe this was just a runaway story with a safe return. But as the hours dragged into days and the days into weeks, the silence around her absence became deafening. As detectives reviewed security footage from local businesses and home surveillance systems, they slowly stitched together her final known movements. Footage from a bakery camera showed her crossing the street with a book tucked under her arm. A doorbell camera caught her a few minutes later, still walking at a steady pace, still looking calm, just 2 blocks from Pine Street. And then, nothing. No more sightings, no more footage. It was as though a curtain had been drawn. One moment she existed, the next she was gone. Police began canvassing the area again, this time more aggressively. They knocked on every door on Pine Street. Most neighbors answered with concern, some with fear. When detectives reached the beige 2-story house midway down the block, Alan Price answered the door promptly, as though he had been expecting them. He appeared helpful, cooperative. He answered all their questions without hesitation. Yes, he'd heard about the missing girl. No, he hadn't seen her that evening. Yes, he'd be willing to let them look around. The officers noted the inside of the house looked tidy, even sterile. Nothing stood out. The place had the feel of a showroom, not a home. But Alan's name didn't raise any red flags. He didn't have a record, no priors, no complaints, not even a parking ticket. He had lived in Maplewood for over a decade. He paid his taxes on time. He volunteered to stack chairs after town events. In a town where everyone kept to their own quiet routines, Alan was forgettable. Comfortingly so, after the search came up empty, the investigation began to shift. Authorities started focusing on possible abduction by a stranger passing through town. Highway exits were checked. Tips from nearby counties came flooding in, most of them leading nowhere. Emily's family waited by the phone, clinging to every call that came in, hoping this one would be different. Then, in late December, nearly 2 months after Emily vanished, a hiker stumbled upon something horrifying. In a remote patch of forest, under a thin layer of loose soil and dead leaves, he spotted a pale hand protruding from the earth. The authorities were called, the area was sealed off. What they unearthed confirmed everyone's worst fear. It was Emily. Her body was bruised. The cause of death? Manual strangulation. Defensive wounds on her arms told a story of struggle. Broken fingernails suggested she had fought hard. But the most disturbing discovery came during the autopsy. Inside her throat was a tiny fragment of thread, green with silver flecks, something that didn't match her clothes. Something small enough to be overlooked, but strange enough to raise questions. It was this single, silent clue that would eventually unravel everything. The discovery of the thread inside Emily Sanderson's throat baffled investigators. It wasn't something one would expect to find, certainly not something that pointed to any obvious suspect. It wasn't fiber from clothing, a blanket, or rope. Lab analysis revealed that it was decorative in nature, green with thin silver metallic strands woven throughout. It didn't come from anything Emily had worn or owned. That made it a clue, and an unusual one. Forensics experts traced it to a home decor manufacturer that had gone out of business years earlier. The thread came from a limited run of decorative throw pillows sold exclusively at a high-end home goods chain in 2017. The line was discontinued within a year. There were only a few hundred of these pillows ever sold in the region, and most had long since been discarded. But thanks to a store membership program, the company still had a partial purchase history linked to customer phone numbers and emails. Detectives combed through the list. Most of the customers had either moved away or still had the pillows and gladly turned them over. One customer stood out, not because of anything on the list itself, but because of what had already been going on in the background. Alan Price. He had purchased 2 of the same green and silver pillows nearly 6 years ago. At the time, that detail might have seemed like a coincidence, even meaningless. But paired with the fact that Emily disappeared near his street, it started to feel more like a thread in a larger web, one they hadn't yet seen. It gave authorities a legitimate reason to take a second look. They went back to Alan's house with a renewed focus, this time armed with a warrant to search the entire property, including outbuildings, the attic, and the garage. Alan remained oddly calm throughout the process. He sat on his front steps while investigators moved in and out of the house, never asking what they were looking for, never showing concern. That detachment struck some officers as strange. Cold, the house was spotless, impossibly clean, too clean. No dust, no clutter, everything had a place. Even the books on the shelves were arranged alphabetically by author. The refrigerator was half empty, filled only with water, eggs, and 2 identical containers of plain yogurt. But the most unsettling part was how little life there was. No framed photos, no signs of personal history. No laptop, no family heirlooms, not even a junk drawer. It was in the upstairs closet where they found the first clue. One of the green and silver pillows, vacuum-sealed in a plastic bag, stored neatly beside 2 others with different patterns. The pillow had trace evidence that matched the fiber found in Emily's throat. That alone wasn't enough for an arrest, but it was enough to escalate the investigation to a more urgent level. Detectives examined the walls for unusual voids or hollows and eventually discovered a segment of the laundry room wall that sounded different when tapped. It took only minutes to confirm that it wasn't solid. Behind the drywall was a hidden panel, and behind that, a narrow staircase leading downward. The space below was pitch black, cold. It had been carefully constructed, insulated, and soundproofed. At first glance, it looked like a storage cellar. But what stood in the center of the room erased any doubt that this was something far more sinister. There was a single metal chair, bolted to the floor. Restraint cuffs were mounted on the arms and legs. The walls were bare except for hooks. In the far corner was a table, neatly arranged with rubber gloves, sealed plastic bags, and cleaning supplies. The pillow fiber had led them to a place no one knew existed. And now it was clear, Emily's death had not been the result of a chance encounter. It was planned, deliberate, controlled. The man they had seen as polite, ordinary, even dull, was far more methodical than anyone could have imagined. The discovery of the hidden basement sent shockwaves through the investigative team. No one had expected to find something so elaborate, so meticulously designed. The narrow staircase leading down into darkness was just the beginning. As they descended, flashlights flickered across concrete walls, revealing a room that felt more like a bunker than a part of a suburban home. There were no windows, no vents. The air was still and stale, as if it hadn't moved in years. The metal chair in the center of the room wasn't ordinary. It had been welded into the ground, its steel arms fitted with cuffs that showed signs of wear. Deep scratches etched into the padding where hands had struggled. A small drain was embedded in the floor just beneath it, perfectly centered. Around the room, cleaning supplies were stored with surgical precision. Bottles of bleach, gloves sealed in sterile packaging, thick plastic sheets folded into neat squares. Along one wall was a corkboard. Pinned to it were maps of the town, marked with colored pins, some near schools, others near walking trails or bus stops. Each pin had a date written next to it. None of the names were labeled, but the timeline overlapped disturbingly with the disappearances of young women reported in towns as far as 60 miles away. Many of those cases had gone cold. Now they were being re-examined with a new and horrifying context. Most chilling of all were the photographs. Hundreds of Polaroids, some faded and yellowing with time, were stored in a locked cabinet at the far end of the room. The images varied. Some were zoomed-in shots of women walking alone. Others were pictures taken through windows, clearly without the subject's knowledge. Each one had a date written on the back in the same tidy handwriting. Some of the women in the photos had never been reported missing. Others had, and now investigators feared they might not just be missing, they might be buried in forgotten woods like Emily had been. But there was more. Hidden inside a hollowed-out vent behind the cabinet were notebooks, dozens of them, each one identical in size and style, labeled chronologically by year. At first glance, they appeared to be journals, but as investigators flipped through the pages, it became clear they were far more sinister. The entries were methodical. Allen had documented his observations of women throughout the town, times they left for work, their routines, what they wore, whether they were distracted, whether they locked their doors. Some entries included sketches of street layouts, descriptions of vehicles parked outside certain homes, notes on the timing of porch lights. It was stalking disguised as study. Some entries were marked with stars. Those were the most detailed, spanning several pages. One of them was Emily's. The entry on her began months before her disappearance. It described her walk to the library, her schedule, what time she typically returned home. The final page simply read, "Thursday, rain forecasted, fewer witnesses." With the weight of this evidence, investigators knew they were no longer looking at a single murder. This was the work of a predator who had spent years perfecting his method. He hadn't made mistakes, not until now. Emily's death had left behind a clue he hadn't accounted for. That single strand of decorative thread had unraveled the illusion. And through it all, Allen Price remained eerily composed. Even as he was brought in for questioning, he didn't ask why. He didn't resist. He didn't flinch. He sat in the interrogation room with the same calm expression he wore behind the print shop counter, as if none of it mattered, as if it had all gone exactly as he'd planned. But the truth was no longer hidden behind pristine walls and polite smiles. The house on Pine Street had revealed what it had been concealing for years. Not just a murderer, but a man who had built his life around deception, control, and silence. The arrest of Allen Price shattered the illusion Maplewood had wrapped itself in for so long. The man who had lived among them as a quiet, helpful neighbor was now exposed as a cold, calculating predator. News vans lined the streets, cameras flashing as officers escorted Allen from his beige house in handcuffs. The same wind chimes that once gave the neighborhood a sense of calm now jangled eerily in the background. The entire town watched in stunned silence, but the story didn't end with his arrest. It was only the beginning of a deeper descent into darkness. In the days that followed, investigators scoured every inch of Allen's property and began tracing his connections to surrounding towns. His journals, once just disturbing curiosities, quickly became roadmaps for a multi-jurisdictional task force. At least 7 cold cases from the past 12 years suddenly found new life, each involving a missing young woman last seen in areas Allen had visited or documented. Details from the notebooks matched aspects of these disappearances too precisely to be coincidence. The pins on his wall were now seen for what they truly were: trophies. Even more chilling was the realization that Allen hadn't always operated in Maplewood. Before moving there, he had lived in 2 other towns, both of which had seen disappearances eerily similar to Emily's. Local police departments began revisiting their files, combing through unsolved cases and analyzing evidence with renewed urgency. In one case, soil samples found at an old crime scene in a wooded area turned out to match the exact composition of the dirt from Allen's backyard flower beds. It wasn't just circumstantial, it was damning. Inside the courtroom, Allen remained eerily silent. He didn't plead, didn't object, didn't so much as blink when the prosecution laid out the mountain of evidence against him. The photographs, the journals, the hidden room, the pillow fiber. His face remained a blank mask, unbothered by the weight of his own monstrosity. The trial gripped the public. National outlets picked up the story. Articles described him as the neighbor-next-door killer, the silent stalker, and, more hauntingly, the man nobody noticed. Testimonies from victims' families brought the courtroom to tears. Photos of the girls, their bright futures cut short, were held up in court, each one a reminder of the horror hidden behind Allen's door. One detail from the trial shook everyone. A forensic psychologist, after reviewing Allen's journals and crime scene evidence, described him as someone who didn't kill out of impulse or rage. He killed to observe, to control. Every step was a part of a quiet experiment. It wasn't about anger. It wasn't even about the victims. It was about perfecting his process. The murders were a methodical ritual, something he refined over time like a craftsman. When the jury returned with a verdict, it took only an hour. Guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced him to life without parole. The courtroom erupted, not with cheers, but with a silent wave of relief, as if the entire town had been holding its breath for months. Allen was escorted out in chains, never once looking back. After the trial, Maplewood was left to pick up the pieces. The print shop closed down, his house was condemned and later demolished, and a community garden was planted in its place, symbolic, an attempt to reclaim the space where so much horror had been hidden, but the scars remained. People in town now locked their doors religiously, watched their children more closely, and looked twice at every stranger. Allen Price had changed them. Forever. He had been the man no one noticed, the one no one feared, the normal guy who had become the ultimate warning that evil doesn't always come with fangs or fury. Sometimes it smiles politely, holds the door open, and waters its lawn at 6 a.m. every morning.